The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of courtroom 7, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. Judge Helen Carter adjusted her black robes and squared her shoulders, preparing for another day of cases. After 15 years on the bench, she had developed a reputation for being strict but fair. At least, that's what she told herself. The next case seemed straightforward enough. A young man, just 17, stood before her. His school uniform was neatly pressed, hands clasped tightly in front of him. Despite his composed appearance, his eyes couldn't hide the fear of what might happen next. "Your Honor," the public defender began, "my client is a senior at Washington High. He maintains a 3.8 GPA and has already been accepted to 3 universities. This is his first offense, and we have evidence suggesting he wasn't even present when the vandalism occurred." Judge Carter glanced at the case file, then back at the teenager. Something about his presence irritated her, though she couldn't quite place why. Perhaps it was his calm demeanor. Shouldn't he show more remorse? She'd seen too many young offenders act entitled, thinking their good grades would excuse their behavior. The prosecutor presented security camera footage showing someone spray painting the wall of a local business. The figure was roughly the same height and build as the accused, wearing similar clothes. But the video was grainy, taken at night, and even the prosecutor admitted it wasn't conclusive evidence. 3 character witnesses spoke on the young man's behalf: his physics teacher, his basketball coach, and the elderly woman whose lawn he mowed every weekend. They painted a picture of a responsible, hard-working student who spent his free time helping others and working toward his dream of becoming an engineer. "He was with me that evening," the physics teacher insisted. "We were preparing for the state science competition until 9 p.m. I signed him out of the building myself. There's security footage from the school that can prove it." Judge Carter felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the kind that came whenever someone challenged her judgment. She'd seen too many cases where supportive communities rallied around young offenders, making excuses for their behavior. In her experience, making an example of them early was the best way to prevent future crimes. The young man finally spoke, his voice steady despite his nervousness. "Your Honor, I know how serious these charges are. But I swear to you, I was at school that night. I've worked too hard for my future to throw it away like this. Please just look at the school's security footage." Instead of requesting the additional evidence, Judge Carter straightened in her chair. The courtroom fell silent, sensing her decision had been made. The afternoon light caught her sterling silver gavel as she lifted it, its shadow falling across her desk like a final verdict. "This court has seen enough," she declared, her voice echoing through the chamber. "Despite your academic achievements, actions have consequences. Perhaps this will serve as a lesson to others who think their status protects them from responsibility." The sentence fell like a thunderbolt. 3 years. The gallery erupted in shocked whispers. The young man's shoulders slumped, his carefully maintained composure finally breaking. His father, sitting in the front row, stood up abruptly but remained silent, his face a mask of controlled anger and disbelief. As Judge Carter gathered her papers, preparing to move on to the next case, she caught a glimpse of a familiar-looking pin on the father's lapel, the kind worn by city officials. Something about it nagged at her mind, but she pushed the thought away. After all, she had more cases to hear, and justice waited for no one. Little did she know, this decision would set in motion events that would force her to question everything she thought she knew about justice, fairness, and her own hidden biases. The news of the harsh sentence spread through the city like wildfire. By the next morning, a crowd had gathered outside the courthouse steps, their signs waving in the crisp autumn air. "Justice for our youth," and "Stop unfair sentencing," read the handmade posters, held high by parents, teachers, and students from the local high school. The young man's physics teacher stood at his desk that morning, staring at the empty seat in the front row. The science competition materials they'd worked on together just days ago still sat in a neat pile on the corner of his desk. He picked up his phone, dialing the local news station for the third time that week. "I have proof," he insisted. "Security footage from that night. Why won't anyone listen?" Inside the courthouse, Judge Carter tried to focus on her current cases, but the muffled chanting from outside kept breaking her concentration. "Order in the court," she called out sharply, though the noise wasn't coming from inside her courtroom. Her clerk noticed how she kept glancing at her computer, where local news websites displayed headlines questioning her decision. The young man's first day in juvenile detention played out in stark contrast to his normal routine. Instead of solving complex equations in physics class, he sat in a bare room, wearing standard-issue clothes that were 2 sizes too big. His cellmate, noticing his pressed uniform when he arrived, whispered, "First time, huh? What'd they get you for?" Back at Washington High, students organized a peaceful walkout. They sat silently on the school lawn, each holding a textbook, a reminder of their absent classmate who should have been studying with them. The school principal, though officially unable to support the protest, made no move to stop it. Instead, he stood watching from his office window, his own daughter among the protesters. The local newspaper ran a detailed analysis of Judge Carter's previous sentencing records. The numbers painted a troubling picture. Minority youth consistently received sentences 3 times longer than their counterparts for similar offenses. The article was picked up by larger news outlets, bringing national attention to their small city. In the detention center's visiting area, the young man's father sat straight-backed in the uncomfortable plastic chair, his mayoral campaign pin now removed from his suit jacket. He listened as his son described his first week behind bars, noting every detail with the precision of a man who'd spent his life fighting for justice in the courtroom. Only now, the fight had become deeply personal. Community leaders began organizing town halls to discuss the broader implications of the case. Local business owners, remembering the young man who used to help elderly customers carry their groceries, spoke up about the impact on the community. The owner of the vandalized building even came forward, expressing doubt about the identification and offering to withdraw the complaint. Judge Carter's own clerk, who had worked with her for 5 years, started leaving printouts of similar cases on her desk, ones where white teenagers had received only community service for more serious offenses. She didn't comment on them, but she noticed how the judge's hand would pause over each one before brushing them aside. At home each evening, Judge Carter found herself unable to escape the controversy. Her usual news programs now featured legal experts discussing her decision. Her neighborhood coffee shop, where she'd gotten her morning coffee for a decade, had a donation jar for the young man's legal defense fund sitting right next to the register. The teenager's college acceptance letters continued arriving at his home, each one now accompanied by a note about holding his spot for the following year. His mother placed them carefully in a box, alongside the science competition medal he'd won last semester. Every night, she added another day to the calendar marking the days until appeal, her determination growing stronger with each marked box. The pressure was building, but no one could have predicted how a chance encounter at an upcoming city function would shatter Judge Carter's carefully constructed worldview, forcing her to confront truths she'd spent years ignoring. The annual City Leadership Gala was in full swing, crystal chandeliers casting a warm glow over the crowd of well-dressed attendees. Judge Carter stood near the refreshment table, sipping sparkling water and making small talk with other city officials. She'd almost declined the invitation this year, but her position demanded certain social appearances. "Ladies and gentlemen," the event coordinator announced, tapping a glass for attention. "Please welcome our newly elected mayor." The crowd parted, and Judge Carter's glass nearly slipped from her hand. Walking toward the podium was a familiar face, the same man who had sat silently in her courtroom just weeks ago, watching his son being sentenced. The same man whose controlled anger she dismissed. Only now, he wore the mayoral sash across his chest. The new mayor adjusted the microphone, his voice filling the ballroom. "Thank you all for being here tonight. As I begin my term, I want to address the state of our justice system. He paused, his eyes scanning the room. A system that should protect all our children equally. Judge Carter felt rooted to the spot as he continued speaking. She listened as he shared statistics about youth rehabilitation programs, about the cost of lost potential, about the importance of fair treatment under the law. Though he never mentioned his son directly, every word seemed to echo through her consciousness. Just last month, he said, I watched a bright young man with a full scholarship lose his future to an unjust system. A young man who spent his weekends tutoring children at our community center. A young man who could have been any of our children. The room had grown so quiet you could hear the ice settling in water glasses. Judge Carter noticed other guests glancing her way, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed judgment. Her usual confidence felt like a thin shield against the weight of their stares. After his speech, the mayor worked his way through the crowd, shaking hands and accepting congratulations. Judge Carter considered slipping out early, but something kept her there. Perhaps it was the same stubborn pride that had made her stick to her decision in court. Then suddenly, he was standing right in front of her. Judge Carter, he said, his voice perfectly professional. I believe we've met before, though under different circumstances. She struggled to maintain her composure. Mr. Mayor, I didn't realize. Few people did, he replied. I kept my campaign relatively quiet while focusing on my family's more pressing concerns. The weight of his words hung in the air between them. If you're requesting a private meeting about the case, she began. Actually, he interrupted gently, I'm here to invite you to visit our community center tomorrow. See the tutoring program your latest sentencing decision has left without one of its best volunteers. Meet the children who keep asking when their favorite math tutor is coming back. Before she could respond, another city official called for the mayor's attention. He turned to leave, then paused. You know, Judge Carter, true justice isn't about maintaining our pride. It's about having the courage to admit when we might be wrong. As he walked away, Judge Carter found herself alone with her thoughts, the elegant party continuing around her in a blur. Her carefully constructed justifications began to crumble as she remembered the school security footage she'd dismissed, the character witnesses she'd ignored, and most importantly, the look in that young man's eyes when she delivered her sentence. The drive home that night felt longer than usual. The mayor's words kept replaying in her mind, along with images of her courtroom now seen through a different lens. She thought about her own daughter, away at college, and wondered how she would feel if someone judged her so harshly based on mere assumptions. For the first time in her career, Judge Carter began to question not just one decision, but an entire pattern of thinking she'd never before had the courage to examine. The next morning would bring choices she never expected to face, and a chance to redefine what justice really meant. Sleep didn't come easy for Judge Carter that night. By 6 in the morning, she was already at her office, pulling out the case file she tried so hard to forget. The morning light crept through her window as she spread the documents across her desk, this time reading every detail with new eyes. Her hands trembled slightly as she pressed play on the security footage, the grainy video she'd used to justify her decision. Now, watching it for the 5th time, she noticed details she'd overlooked before. The person in the video was wearing a red jacket. According to the arrest report, the young man had been wearing blue that night. She picked up her phone and called the high school. This is Judge Carter. I need to see your security footage from the night of the incident. The secretary hesitated, then explained that the physics teacher had been trying to share that same footage for weeks. An hour later, she sat in the school's security office, watching a different video. There he was, clear as day, working with his physics teacher until 9 p.m., the exact time the vandalism occurred across town. Her stomach tightened as she checked her own handwritten notes from the trial. Previous cases show a pattern, she'd written. Need to send a strong message. Reading between the lines of her own notes, she saw something ugly. Assumptions she'd made based on nothing more than her own biases. She drove to the community center the mayor had mentioned. It was a simple building, nothing fancy, but inside she found a wall of photos. There he was again, surrounded by smiling elementary school kids, teaching them math with a patient smile. A volunteer coordinator approached her, not recognizing her without her robes. "Oh, you're asking about our star tutor," the coordinator said warmly. "Such a shame what happened. Those kids still ask about him every day. Little Amy was failing math before he started helping her. Now she's top of her class." Back in her chambers, Judge Carter opened her laptop and began reviewing her past cases. She created a spreadsheet, inputting data from hundreds of decisions she'd made over the years. The pattern that emerged made her feel sick. The numbers didn't lie. She had consistently given harsher sentences to minority youth, even when the circumstances were identical. Her clerk knocked on the door, carrying more files. "Your Honor, I found those similar cases you asked for." She placed them on the desk. 5 cases of vandalism from the past year, all involving white teenagers, all given community service or suspended sentences. Judge Carter picked up her phone again, this time calling her old law school mentor, a retired judge known for his fairness. "I need your advice," she said, her voice barely steady. "I think I've made a terrible mistake." "The question isn't whether you made a mistake," he replied after listening to her story. "The question is what you're going to do about it now." She spent the rest of the afternoon writing, drafting, and redrafting a motion to review the case. Each word felt like a confession, an admission of her own failures. But with each paragraph, she felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. The young man's file lay open on her desk, his school photo looking up at her. A bright smile, a clean record, a future full of promise. All put on hold because she hadn't bothered to look past her own prejudices. As the sun set outside her window, Judge Carter made one final call to her court clerk. "I need you to clear my schedule for tomorrow morning," she said, "and contact the district attorney's office. It's time to right a wrong." She gathered her things to leave, catching her reflection in her office window. The face looking back at her seemed different somehow, humbled, but also more determined. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for the first time in weeks, she felt like she was finally doing her job, serving justice, real justice, not just enforcing her own biases. Judge Carter sat in her garden, surrounded by the roses she'd planted years ago. But for the first time in weeks, she wasn't thinking about flowers. She'd taken a leave of absence from the court, something she'd never done in 15 years on the bench. Her daughter had called, worried about the sudden decision, but Carter knew she needed this time. Today, she was meeting someone who might help her understand her own blind spots. Her old mentor, retired Judge Richardson, had agreed to talk with her. At 75, he was one of the first black judges in their district, and he tried to guide her early in her career. "You know," he said, settling into the garden chair with a cup of tea, "I watched you grow from a passionate law student into a respected judge. But somewhere along the way, you stopped listening." She flinched at his words. "I thought I was being fair. I thought I was being tough, but just." "Being tough isn't the same as being just," he replied softly. "Remember when you first started? You wanted to change the system from within. What happened to that young lawyer who used to visit juvenile detention centers to understand the kids better?" The question hit hard. She remembered those visits, how each young face had told a different story. When had she stopped seeing the stories and started seeing just cases to clear from her docket? That afternoon, she pulled out old photo albums. There she was at her swearing-in ceremony, so full of ideals. A picture of her daughter's high school graduation next to it caught her eye. Her daughter had gotten into trouble once, caught drinking at a party, but Carter had called in favors, kept it quiet. "She's just a teenager," she'd said then. "She deserves a second chance." The hypocrisy of that memory made her stomach turn. How many second chances had she denied from her bench? She drove through her city's neighborhoods that evening, past the wealthy suburbs where she lived, through the working class areas, into the communities she rarely visited. Outside a community center, kids played basketball. She thought about the young man she'd sentenced, how he used to coach youth basketball here on weekends. At home, she found an old journal from her first year as a judge. Her early entries were full of careful consideration for each case, detailed notes about circumstances and context. When had she started seeing numbers instead of people? Her phone buzzed. Another message from the court asking when she'd return. But she wasn't ready. Instead, she called her daughter. "Mom, what's really going on?" Her daughter asked. "I've never seen you take time off." "I'm learning," Carter replied, her voice catching. "I'm learning that sometimes being strong means admitting you were wrong." She spent the next day watching her old court videos, seeing herself through new eyes. The subtle differences in how she spoke to different defendants became painfully clear. A slight edge in her voice here, a dismissed explanation there. That evening, she visited her childhood home, now occupied by another family. She remembered her father, also a judge, and his stern beliefs about maintaining order. She'd inherited his robe, and she now realized many of his prejudices. Back in her study, she began writing, not legal briefs this time, but a personal record of her journey. "Today, I understand that true justice isn't about punishment," she wrote. "It's about seeing the humanity in everyone who stands before you." As night fell, she sat in her quiet house, thinking about the young man in detention. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of reviewing his case. But tonight, she had to finish something more personal, confronting her own biases, one painful memory at a time. The path to change wasn't just about one case. It was about acknowledging that even people who think they're doing right can be wrong. For the first time in her career, Judge Carter wasn't just reading law books. She was reading her own heart. The morning sun hadn't yet risen when Judge Carter parked her car outside City Hall. Her hands clutched a thick folder containing the motion she'd spent weeks preparing. Today, she would do something few judges ever did: officially admit to a mistake and fight to correct it. She requested an early morning meeting with the mayor before the building filled with its usual bustle. The security guard recognized her, but did a double take at the time. 6:30 a.m. was unusually early for anyone, even for the always punctual judge. The mayor was already in his office, reviewing documents at his desk. He looked up as she entered, his expression carefully neutral. The last time they'd been in a room together had been at the gala, and the memory of that night still made her uncomfortable. "Your Honor," he said formally, standing to greet her. "This is unexpected." "Please," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Today I'm not here as a judge. I'm here as someone who needs to right a wrong." She placed the folder on his desk and began explaining her investigation. The overlooked evidence, the school security footage, her own documented pattern of biased sentencing. The mayor listened silently, his expression unchanging as she spoke. "I've filed a motion to review the case," she concluded. "But I wanted you to hear this from me first, not through legal channels. Your son deserves justice, and I failed to provide it." The mayor was quiet for a long moment. "Do you know what my son told me during my last visit?" he finally said. He was more worried about the younger kids he tutored falling behind in math than about himself. "That's the kind of person he is, the kind of person you never took the time to see." Judge Carter nodded, feeling the weight of his words. "I can't give him back the months he's lost, but I can try to make it right." She explained her plan, not just to overturn the conviction, but to push for systemic changes in the court's sentencing guidelines. She wanted to establish a review board for juvenile cases, require implicit bias training for all judges, and create a community oversight committee. The mayor leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You realize this could end your career? Some people won't take kindly to these changes." "My career isn't more important than justice," she replied. "It took me too long to learn that." As they discussed the details, the sun began to rise over the city, casting long shadows through the office windows. They talked about practical steps, about the resistance they'd face, about how to turn this individual case into lasting change. Later that morning, Judge Carter stood before her colleagues in the judge's chambers, presenting her findings and her proposal. Some faces showed support, others skepticism, and a few open hostility. But she kept speaking, her voice growing stronger with each word. "We're not just here to interpret laws," she told them. "We're here to ensure justice. And sometimes that means having the courage to admit we failed." By afternoon, news of her motion had spread through the courthouse. Her clerk handed her messages from other judges, from lawyers, from community leaders, some supporting, some critical, all recognizing the significance of what she was doing. As she left the courthouse that evening, she passed the spot where protesters had stood weeks before. The space was empty now, but she could still hear their voices calling for justice. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. The challenging process of not just freeing one young man, but of changing an entire system. For the first time since starting this journey, Judge Carter felt truly certain of her path. She had spent years building a reputation for being tough. Now it was time to build a new reputation, one based on fairness, understanding, and true justice. The courtroom felt different today. Judge Carter sat at the bench wearing the same black robes, but everything else had changed. The gallery was packed, with people standing along the walls. News cameras waited outside, hoping to catch the historic moment when a judge would publicly acknowledge and correct her own mistake. The young man sat with his parents, wearing his school blazer. 3 months in detention had left its mark. His shoulders were slightly hunched, his eyes more cautious. But there was still strength in his posture, dignity in the way he held himself. "The court is now in session," the bailiff announced, his voice echoing through the hushed room. Judge Carter looked out at the faces before her. The same physics teacher who had tried so hard to present the evidence. The basketball kids from the community center who had written letters about their mentor. The business owner who had withdrawn his complaint after reviewing the facts. "Before we proceed," she began, her voice clear and steady, "I want to address this court not just as a judge, but as someone who has learned a difficult but vital lesson." She detailed her findings, the school security footage showing the young man's true whereabouts, the inconsistencies in the original evidence, and most importantly, her own documented pattern of biased sentencing. "The justice system works only when those who run it are willing to examine their own failures," she continued. "Today, I'm not just reviewing a case. I'm acknowledging that I failed in my most basic duty, to provide equal justice under law." The district attorney stood next, presenting their own review of the evidence. "In light of the new information and our independent investigation, the state moves to vacate the conviction and dismiss all charges." A soft murmur ran through the courtroom. The young man's mother reached for her husband's hand, tears streaming silently down her face. Furthermore, Judge Carter added, "This court will be implementing new procedures for juvenile cases." She outlined the changes: mandatory review of all evidence, including character testimony and school records, regular bias training for court officials, and a community oversight board for sentencing guidelines. "Would the defendant please rise?" she said finally. The young man stood, his father, the mayor, standing supportively beside him. "This court apologizes for the miscarriage of justice in your case. Your conviction is vacated, all charges are dismissed, and your record will be expunged." She paused, then added something judges rarely say. "I personally apologize for failing to see you as an individual deserving of fair treatment. You have shown remarkable strength throughout this ordeal." As the words "case dismissed" echoed through the courtroom, 3 months of tension broke. The young man's friends from the community center burst into applause. His physics teacher wiped away tears. Even the bailiff was smiling. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered around the family. The young man spoke briefly, showing a grace beyond his years. "I just want to get back to helping my kids with their math," he said, referring to his tutoring students. Judge Carter watched from her chamber window as the crowd dispersed. A stack of files sat on her desk. Other cases she needed to review, other potential wrongs to right. This was just the beginning. Her clerk knocked gently. "Your Honor, the Oversight Committee is ready for their first meeting." She nodded, gathering her notes. Today had ended one chapter, but the real work was just beginning. As she headed to the meeting room, she passed the words engraved above the courthouse entrance: "Equal justice under law." For the first time in her career, she felt truly committed to making those words mean something. 6 months had passed since that dramatic day in court. Judge Carter stood at the podium of the State Judicial Conference, facing a room full of judges from across the state. Her hands weren't shaking anymore when she spoke about difficult topics. Practice had made it easier. "When I started my career," she began, "I thought being a good judge meant being tough. Today, I know it means being fair, being honest, and sometimes being brave enough to admit our mistakes." The slides behind her told a story in numbers and graphs. The changes her courthouse had implemented, the results they'd seen. Juvenile detention rates had dropped by 40%. Rehabilitation program success rates had doubled. But it wasn't just about statistics. During breaks between sessions, other judges approached her. Some shared their own doubts about past decisions. Others asked for advice on starting similar programs in their districts. A few even admitted to reviewing their own sentencing patterns after hearing about her experience. Back in her own courthouse, changes were everywhere. The once empty waiting room now hosted volunteer tutors who helped kids with homework while their cases were pending. A new youth advisory board, made up of local teenagers, met monthly to provide perspective on juvenile cases. The mayor had become an unexpected ally. Together, they'd secured funding for a groundbreaking program that paired first-time offenders with mentors instead of sending them to detention. The program was already showing promising results. In her office, Judge Carter kept a special letter framed on her wall. It was from a little girl who'd been struggling with math. "Thank you for giving us back our tutor. I got an A on my test last week." These small victories meant more than any legal recognition. She'd also started teaching a new course at the law school: Equity in Justice, recognizing and addressing bias in the legal system. Her students weren't just learning about laws. They were learning about the human impact of their future decisions. One afternoon, while visiting the community center, she watched a familiar scene unfold. The young man she'd once wrongly sentenced was back at his old tutoring spot, surrounded by kids eager to learn. But now, next to him sat another teenager who'd been facing charges. Instead of detention, he'd been assigned to the mentoring program. The hardest part, she told a reporter who was covering their reforms, isn't changing the rules. It's changing how we think about justice. Every case that comes before us isn't just a file number. It's a life, a future, a chance to either help or harm our community. The changes hadn't come without resistance. Some of her colleagues still disagreed with her approach, arguing it was too soft. But the results spoke for themselves. Repeat offense rates were down. School completion rates were up. The community's trust in the justice system was slowly being rebuilt. At home that evening, Judge Carter reviewed applications for the newly created Youth Justice Advisory Board. Among them was a letter from a teenager who wrote about watching his older brother go through the system. "I want to help make sure other kids get the same second chance he did." Her phone buzzed with a message from her daughter, now in law school herself. "Mom, we're studying your case in ethics class today. You've started something important here." As she prepared for the next day's cases, Judge Carter reflected on how much had changed. Her courtroom still demanded respect, but now it was a different kind. Not based on fear, but on trust. Not on authority alone, but on understanding. The sun was setting outside her window, casting long shadows across her desk. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new challenges, new chances to prove that justice could be both firm and fair. But for the first time in her career, she felt ready to face them all with both her head and her heart engaged in the work. A year had passed. The university auditorium was packed for graduation day. Proud families filled every seat, cameras ready to capture precious moments. Judge Carter sat quietly in the back row, wearing a simple dress instead of her usual robes. She wasn't here as a judge today, but as someone who'd learned an unforgettable lesson. The young man she'd once wrongfully sentenced was graduating with highest honors. Despite losing 3 months of his senior year, he worked twice as hard to catch up, taking extra classes and studying late into the night. His determination had turned a setback into a triumph. The mayor, sitting in the front row as both father and city leader, beamed with pride. Next to him sat the physics teacher who had fought so hard to prove his students' innocence. They'd become close friends over the past year, working together on education initiatives for at-risk youth. And now, the dean announced, our student speaker, selected by both faculty and peers, will address the graduating class. The young man walked to the podium, his graduation gown flowing behind him. The audience fell silent, many knowing his story, others about to hear it for the first time. A year ago, he began, I learned that life isn't always fair. But I also learned that change is possible when people have the courage to admit their mistakes and work to fix them. His eyes met Judge Carter's briefly across the crowded room. He spoke about his time tutoring kids in detention centers, how he turned his own experience into a way to help others. The mentoring program he'd started had already helped dozens of young people find better paths. After the ceremony, families gathered outside for photos. The young graduate was surrounded by his former tutoring students, all wearing future college graduate t-shirts he'd given them. One little boy proudly showed him a math test marked with an A+. Judge Carter watched from a distance, but the mayor spotted her and waved her over. You should be part of this, he said warmly. You're part of the story too, the hard part, yes, but also the part about change and growth. Standing there, among the celebrating families, Judge Carter thought about all that had changed. Her courthouse had become a model for juvenile justice reform. Other cities were adopting their programs. The mentoring system she helped create had spread to 3 other states. The young graduate approached her, holding his diploma. I'm starting law school in the fall, he told her. I want to be a juvenile defense attorney. Someone needs to stand up for kids who don't have a voice. His words hit home. From her mistake, a new advocate for justice would rise. Sometimes the biggest wrongs could lead to unexpected rights. Later that evening, at the graduation party, Judge Carter watched as the young man danced with his mother, laughed with his friends, and encouraged his young tutoring students to dream big. His resilience hadn't just changed his own life. It had created ripples that would touch countless others. As she prepared to leave, he stopped her. You know, he said thoughtfully, what happened to me was wrong. But what you did afterward, admitting your mistake, working to change the system, that was right. Sometimes our worst moments can lead to our best changes. Walking to her car under the starlit sky, Judge Carter felt a deep sense of peace. The story that had begun with an injustice had transformed into something powerful. A lesson about growth, about courage, and about the real meaning of justice. Tomorrow, she would return to her courtroom. New cases would come before her, new decisions would need to be made. But now she had a different lens through which to view justice. One that saw the humanity in every person who stood before her. One that understood the power of both accountability and redemption. The night air was warm with promise. Somewhere in the distance, fireworks began to pop and sparkle, celebrating all the graduates. Each burst of lights seemed to signal new beginnings, new possibilities, and the endless potential for positive change.